hear me, friend? On the block, we began. Take it to all the world with internet.
Well, there's a very interesting issue here, and I like to call it atomization, yeah, which I've spoken about, on my radio show, blogs, interviews, and that's where humanity, people in general, the news media, have been habitualized to quick fixes and sound bites. So I'm going to take you back 1400 years. Yeah?
Okay.
Now, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was alive, he, as I mentioned earlier, he was being terrorized by the Bani Umayyah and the hypocrites, or the munafiqs. Munafiq is the Arabic word for hypocrites. There's a whole chapter in the Quran called The Hypocrites. And we have to look at some key moments in Islam in the early days. And one of the key things to note are two personalities which will reoccur from the time of the Prophet, after the Prophet passed away, the subsequent empires, and then right up to the 20th and the 21st century with ISIS. And I hope in as quick and compressed time to hopefully get that across to the listeners, the audience here. Now, Abu Bakr and Umar are sort of seen as, they were the first and second caliphs of Islam. They're praised by, and you've heard of, I'm sure the audience would have heard of, Sunni Muslims. So Shamima Begum joined the group that is affiliated and part of the Sunni Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah milieu. Yes? So that's what she's part of. That's what ISIS is part of. Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, these sorts of personalities, Abu Hanifa, etc., etc. So that's the sort of strand, and this all goes back to Abu Bakr and Umar, who were companions of the Prophet. Now, as to their companionship, as to their personality, and again, I'm only quoting from the history books, so any listeners here jumping up, getting all emotional and riled up and want to kill Aston Walk or whatever, I mean, do as you please anyway. You know what I mean?
We don't have any listeners like that, but we know there's fringe people out there that, as you said.
Exactly. And I'm more than equipped. I'm no tough guy, but I've certainly made a contribution, yeah? So the issue at hand is Abu Bakr and Umar were two hypocrites. They were non-believers in Islam, according to the history books. How do we know this? We know this by their belligerent attitude towards the Prophet. Their daughters married the Prophet and treated the Prophet terribly. And again, I'm a Shiite Muslim. I'm a follower of the 12-hour Shia Muslim madhab. So to get my biases out there in the open. So we know, for example, these two personalities and their daughters made the Prophet's life hell. Let me give you some examples. When the Prophet was sort of dying, was passing away, there's a famous chapter in Sahih Bukhari, the calamity of Thursday, or the calamity of the pen. So the Prophet's on his deathbed. This is 11 after the Hijrah. So you can get some sort of perspective there for the more historically astute. and historically. So the Prophet's on his deathbed and he asked for a pen so that he could write down his will. Now these two personalities, one of them, Umar, called the Prophet delirious. Yeah, he said he was delirious. So that's how much faith he had in the mission that the Prophet was entrusted with. And this caused such a commotion because you had two factions. You had the faction that loved the Prophet and his family, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, Imam Ali and Fatima. And then you had another faction, the Sunnis and the Ahlul Sunnah and ISIS, who hated the Prophet and his family, you see? Okay. And this is what GMB or BBC, because they're very knowledgeable, we've got personalities like Hamza Yusuf, Timothy Winters, Dr. Timothy Winters at Cambridge, they are fully briefed on the nuances and the differences and the history. Us mere lay people will struggle. But I can assure you that GMB, the BBC, know all that what I'm telling you and then some. Yeah.
Of course.
So, let's just get that out there. Yeah?
But they're not. Do you feel they're not laying that out to the public?
That is correct. So we have these belligerents, these hypocrites, who, as soon as the Prophet passed away, then launched a terror campaign against the Prophet's family. So when you hear Muslims, so-called Muslims, in inverted commas, talk about, Islam's a religion of peace and terror, what it is these Sunni people who fight, and I was a Sunni for many years, were part of the Bani Umayyah, Khalid bin Walid, Abu Bakr Umar, who were terrorizing and murdering and killing and chopping off the heads of the Prophet's family. So that's 1400 years ago. Then we have the Islamic expansion into Africa, which a lot of people were. And they had this dreadful system of mutilating African boys to make eunuchs. So right there, we have a separation from what I said earlier, Bismillah, the mercy of Allah, and this terrorist nation building.
A side of barbarism.
Absolutely. So that savagery in the name of the Quran, in the name of Allah, is separate from the Prophet's family and the Prophet's mission. So I'm just putting clear.
You're making that plain. So there's, two different sides of factions.
That's correct. Now,